Alright, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Time of Power. So this video is going to be about Sergio Oliva, and that is Sergio Oliva Sr., not his son Sergio Oliva Jr. So Sergio Oliva is a very, very fascinating bodybuilder and a very important member of bodybuilding history. Now, Sergio Oliva is best known for winning the Mr. Olympia competition 3 times in 1967, 1968, and 1969. And he's also known for being one of the only men to have ever defeated Arnold Schwarzenegger in a bodybuilding competition. And that would be at the 1969 Mr. Olympia competition. But the primary reason I wanted to make this video is about Sergio Oliva's comeback. Now, Sergio Oliva is the only Mr. Olympia to have made a comeback after taking a decade away from the Olympia stage. Now, the only 2 other Mr. Olympias that I can think of that had a fairly long hiatus from the Olympia stage would be Arnold Schwarzenegger when he stopped competing in 1975 to go to Hollywood. Then he would come back 5 years later for the 1980 Mr. Olympia. Then Franco Columbu would win the 1976 Mr. Olympia, and he would not win it again until 1981, another 5-year hiatus. So as I mentioned before, Sergio would win his last title in 1969, so that would mean he lost his title at the 1970 Mr. Olympia, where he placed second to Arnold Schwarzenegger for the first time. Now, there was a tiny bit of controversy around the 1970 Mr. Olympia, and some people felt that Sergio beat Schwarzenegger and that Schwarzenegger only won because Joe Weider was pushing him as kind of the poster boy of bodybuilding. But that wasn't really that controversial of a Mr. Olympia. But in 1971, Sergio would be disqualified from the Mr. Olympia for competing in a rival organization's NABBA Mr. Universe. So this is where the controversy and kind of Sergio Oliva's falling out with Joe Weider sort of began and kind of took root, was at that 1971 Mr. Olympia where he was disqualified, but still allowed to guest pose. So now this brings us to the 1972 Mr. Olympia. This would be the final Mr. Olympia that we would see Sergio Oliva compete in. Now, in 1972, a lot of people felt this was much more controversial because leading up to this 1972 Mr. Olympia, Sergio Oliva was training with Arthur Jones. He weighed an off-season weight of 270 pounds at a height of 5'10", which was absolutely massive for a bodybuilder of that era. Many people say his physique was at its biggest and best training with Arthur Jones and leading up to that 1972 Mr. Olympia. Many people suspected he was going to regain his title. So this was where the controversy really took heat. So at the 1972 Mr. Olympia, Sergio Oliva claimed that the reason he lost was because he was apparently still banned from the IFBB, and they told him that's why they had Arnold beat him in 1972, because he was still banned, I guess, from that 1971 ban. Now, Sergio claims he never received a letter, he never received anything to say he was banned from the IFBB, and that he had no clue and no idea. So he claims the IFBB knew he was going to Germany to compete at the Mr. Olympia that year, but they didn't notify him prior to getting on stage. Then after the competition where he placed second, they told him the reason was, according to him, because he was still banned. So Sergio claims that Arnold was gifted that 1972 Mr. Olympia win, basically under false pretenses and really due to politics. So from 1972 onward, this is really the rarity that we see with this Mr. Olympia and Sergio Oliva, is the fact that he was still an active competitive bodybuilder, but just not with the IFBB. He actively competed in the WBBG, where he would win their Mr. Galaxy and Mr. International titles, as well as their Mr. Olympus title. He would also compete in the WABBA, winning their Professional World Cup all the way up until 1981, 3 years prior to his Mr. Olympia comeback in 1984. So this is something that we've never seen in the history of bodybuilding, is a Mr. Olympia winner not only leaving for 12 years from the IFBB, but during those years that he's gone, competing with multiple rival federations and then deciding to come back to the IFBB. Like I said, Arnold and Franco are the only 2 examples that I can think of a long hiatus in between Olympia appearances, but they didn't leave to go compete elsewhere. So Sergio Oliva was a very fascinating Mr. Olympia winner. So he would come back in 1984, and he would look like kind of a shadow of himself. He would not place very well at all. He would place 8th at the 1984 Mr. Olympia. He would try again in 1985, and he would also place 8th there as well. Now, Sergio claims in an interview the reason he didn't look good and the reason he placed 8th at the 1984 Olympia was because his wife convinced him to do something called the Frank Zane diet. So I guess it was some kind of extreme form of dieting because he didn't want to come in too fat. And he blames that diet for his 8th place placing in 1984 and 1985 respectively. He also says that, combined with the past controversies and run-ins that he's had with the IFBB and Joe Weider, that they would never let him place higher than 8th, and they certainly would never let him win the Olympia. So he went into that Olympia knowing that and believing he was never going to win the Olympia again due to the past circumstances. And of course, it was at this comeback Olympia that he would hold up his son, Sergio Oliva Jr., on stage. Now, unfortunately, Sergio Oliva is no longer with us. He passed away back in November of 2012 at the age of 71. But his legacy definitely lives on with his son. And that's one of the things I wanted to mention in this video, is Sergio Oliva Jr. Is going to be a groundbreaking piece of bodybuilding history if he ever competes in the Mr. Olympia. If Sergio Oliva Jr. competes in the Mr. Olympia, regardless of how he places, regardless of whether or not he wins, it's going to be a tremendous part of bodybuilding, because this is something that we've never seen in the history of bodybuilding, is a legacy Mr. Olympia competitor, the son of a Mr. Olympia competing in the Mr. Olympia. So that's something I definitely look forward to seeing. I'm sure you guys are looking forward to it as well. So thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please give it a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.